Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first story from this week regards an experiment that kept mice in the dark for a week and the effect it had on their hearing and brain structure. There's an apocryphal tale that those who lose their eyesight, or similar, have their other senses improved, and this study examined that sort of event. They did this by taking 15 mice, 6 of whom were kept in the dark for a week, and then examining their brain structure and how it changed the neuronal development and connections. They found that there were in fact changes in the neuronal structures of the brain that could explain some of the improvement. They were able to narrow down the findings to not just hearing better, but hearing better at certain frequencies. This meant that the brains had dedicated more neurons to that particular set of sounds or frequencies. In another study related to making sounds, the video recordings that have been published over the last few years by primatologists at the Max Planck Institute have now found a relationship between tree selection, noise, and this behavior. It's been well known for several years now that chimps have been recorded not only engaging in playful behavior by throwing rocks at trees and yelling, but that they do this in an almost ritualistic manner. It was thought that it might be primitive cultural phenomena being seen in these relatively simple organisms, by comparison to humans who have complex religious rites. This process could be considered the earliest development of this in another species. In the past, recordings have shown single apes going off to do this as a sort of bizarre phenomena, and primatologists were unsure as to why they were doing so, and, to a certain extent, how they were choosing which tree hollows to practice with. The team behind it worked to record the sound that the apes produced from the different trees they used, and they found that there were certain properties that they chose the trees for, one of which was whether or not there was internal friction, how sharp the sound was, and what sort of spectrum of frequencies were produced. The researchers have said that it is a redundant process if it's just for play, as the apes not only make loud noises themselves, but make noises from the tree. The fact that they do both would indicate that there is more than just play behind it. One of the researchers has said that ape play is nearly always more impromptu and involves less consideration and planning. The apes go to a lot of effort to choose the right tree for this, which means it may be something like territorial marking. It could be a religious or cultural phenomenon in its early stages, or any number of other possible events that they have yet to understand. In environmental news, Australia is being hit by one of its worst heat waves ever. And, considering Australia's history, that says a lot. Large sections of Australia's east coast have experienced ridiculous temperature rises. Large parts of that are at 40 degrees Celsius or higher. Some regions within that have even experienced temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius or higher. For those of you who do not use a civilized number system, that is 104 and 122 degrees Fahrenheit, respectively. This heat wave is going to affect all of Australia's major cities. And, as has been noted in other What Were They Thinking videos, this will have an adverse effect on the populations. Last time this occurred, there was dust storms that clouded the sky, and Sydney became a health hazard when fires associated with these heat waves created toxic smoke. This heat wave may also exceed the last nationally average temperature of 40.3 degrees Celsius. One of Australia's quirks is that when these heat waves come through in summer, they dry out all of the wild areas of the country, and even those that are not necessarily wild but uninhabited. This leads to large areas full of fuel for fire, which then eventually does catch fire for one reason or another. This is why Australia currently has fire covering an area greater than that of the early 2019 Amazonian rainforest fires, and these are not having an isolated effect. A recent What Were They Thinking video described how these same fires were staining glaciers in New Zealand, thousands of kilometers away. Australia's phenomenal fires are not an isolated event, and a video published on the Science Alert YouTube page highlights the global effect of fire. The video you see playing now demonstrates not only where but what these fires are and how frequently they occur over a year. It's produced by the Copernicus program in Europe, who records the wildfires across the globe this year, and, as they themselves say, they are getting more frequent, longer lasting, and larger. Next is an interesting correction on a long-standing factual error. There's a character from ancient Egypt called Ptah. They are said to be one of the first women in STEM, as they were an ancient Egyptian doctor who lived 5,000 years ago. Unfortunately, the story leading to this character has been found at least to be factually inaccurate, if not outright wrong. Ptah was named by a researcher called Kate Campbell Hurd Mead in a book from 1938 that was titled A History of Women in Medicine from the Earliest Times to the Beginning of the 19th Century. The book summarily describes Ptah as the first woman doctor of the Old Kingdom, who existed around 2730 BC and practiced during the reign of Queen Neferika-Ra, that she is pictured in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings and called the Chief of Physicians. The problems with these claims are many already. Perhaps the most obvious is that the Valley of Kings wasn't in use until 1,000 years after this is said to have been. Secondary to that, the pictures of her that are said to depict both her role and function are not consistent with any other sources. Then you have the records of the period, which do not list her performing a doctor function. This does not mean that there were no female doctors of the period, and in fact there is a leading hypothesis that what has occurred is something of an error in interpretation. Ptah may not in fact be who they think she is, but represent another individual of roughly the same period. There is another character called Peseshet, and we know about her as she's described in a royal tomb. What she did was exactly what is described as the role of Ptah, and it's thought that there may have been a mistake in understanding who it was based on Campbell Hurd Mead's own documentation. Looking at that, the book that she wrote in 1938 may have mistakenly attributed the wrong name to someone who performed a function at the time, and so this misunderstanding has had long-lasting effects. Finally, there is one last anthropological and archaeological study that's proven to be very interesting. The giant Easter Island statues called the Moai have long been a mystery. How did a group of people move these rocks so far given their size and weight? And to a certain extent that's been explained or at least understood. We know where they came from, specifically the only place they could come from, which is a quarry called Rano. Nearly all of the statues came from here, but it is a tiny area. The quarry itself is interesting now because it has opened up more questions than were answered originally. Researchers taking soil samples from here found that it contained all of the necessary trace elements required for a very productive agricultural area, which was not consistent with the rest of the island. It is hypothesized that the population of the Easter Islands diminished after they failed to look after their soil, leading to famine. This led to a reduction in population. But the area around the Rano quarry defies this trend. The researchers believe that the process of carving the Moai may in fact release all of the necessary products into the soil, and that these giant statues were then used as something like a combination of scarecrow and fertility symbol that would look over the incredibly productive soil around the quarry itself. This itself has opened up even more questions about the Easter Islands and the Moai. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting or useful, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions in the comments section below.